Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tiski Sour. I'm Michael Walker. I should start with an apology. There was a mix-up with time zones, which means we've started an hour later than usual. So we do appreciate you hanging around. As ever, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very good, Michael. How are you keeping?
Very well. Very excited for tonight's show. Later on, we're going to be speaking to academic and writer Yara Hawari, live from the West Bank, to find out how the coronavirus crisis is affecting Palestine. Then me and Aaron are going to finish off the show. Talking about the government's testing fudge. They've said they've made their 100,000 tests a day target, but they've had to change the meaning of what it means to do a test to make it. But first of all, we're going to talk about the sexual assault allegations against Joe Biden, which have been corroborated recently and made it into a bit of a political crisis for him. He, for the first time today, came out publicly and addressed those claims. And to do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Ana Kasparian, host and producer of The Young Turks. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. So let's, first of all, actually, you're watching Tiski Sour. You're watching Novara Media. We want to get more people watching this live stream. So make sure you share this link on your social media platforms and tweet on the hashtag Tiski Sour. So to introduce our first story, Biden is, as I'm sure you all know, the presumptive Democratic nominee to take on Donald Trump. But he has had a difficult few weeks. On the one hand, whilst Donald Trump is giving daily press briefings at the White House, Joe Biden is stuck in his basement doing videos on Zoom. But more significantly, Biden has become subject to allegations of serious sexual assault. So the claim made by former employee Tara Reid is that Biden sexually assaulted her back when he was a powerful figure in the Senate in 1993. The charge was initially dismissed by Biden's team, but that was before, over the last 2 weeks, corroborating evidence emerged. First, on the one hand, over the weekend, audio emerged of Reid's mother calling into the Larry King show in 1993, stating that her daughter worked for a senior politician, had complained to his staff, and was rebuffed. Then this Monday, a previous neighbor of Reid came forward to say she had told her that Tara Reid had told her about the assault in the mid-1990s. So both of these developments made Tara Reid's claims seem more credible. These developments prompted Biden to respond publicly for the first time this morning on MSNBC.
No, it is not true. I'm saying unequivocally, it never happened. And it didn't. It never happened.
Do you remember her? Do you remember any types of complaints that she might have made?
I don't remember any type of complaint she may have made. It was 27 years ago. And I don't remember, nor does anyone else that I'm aware of. And the fact is that I don't remember. I don't remember any complaint ever having been made.
Biden talking to MSNBC this morning. Anna, what should we make of all this? How serious do these allegations seem? How big a deal is this in American politics?
For anyone who is consistent on taking accusations of sexual assault seriously, this is a big deal. And unfortunately, Biden finally addressing it after weeks of pressure to do so has only raised more concerns, more questions, as opposed to making people like me, at least, feel a little more comfortable about possibly casting a vote for him in November, should the election go off without a hitch, which at this point we don't know. He made some distinction between the records that individuals want to look into to see whether or not there's any documentation of Tara Reid's accusation at the time. Now, he refuses to allow, investigators or the general public to look into his senatorial records, which are being kept in the University of Delaware. And he claims that if there's any documentation, they would be kept in a different place, which reporters have actually indicated, no, that's not necessarily true. If those records existed, they would be in the University of Delaware. He doesn't want to allow us to see those records because he says that there are certain conversations he's had, certain policy discussions he's had that could be taken out of context, and it could hurt him in this presidential election. But I would argue it hurts him far more than, any possible policy discussion taken out of context is a credible sexual assault allegation that stands, that hasn't really had a true investigation done. And it makes many women especially feel uncomfortable voting for him.
Mm. I mean, I saw that argument on MSNBC this morning where he was saying, I don't want people to look through. I think it's, there's sort of a cachet of all of his old documents about his policy positions, etc. And he's saying, I don't want people rifling through those when I'm standing for president. And I think he's a bit worried it will be like Hillary's emails all over again, right?
I'm sure he's worried about that. Hillary's emails, I mean, I know that there's a lot of emphasis on that when it comes to the more establishment Democratic politicians. They want to blame Hillary's loss on the email scandal, but she lost that election due to a number of different factors. I don't think that, policy discussions that he's had in the mid 1990s is going to be the new Hillary's emails in this election. He's already dealing with a very serious, very credible sexual assault allegation. He is not being as transparent as he could be. And I think that's raising even more concern. And it's curious that it took literally weeks and all this pressure for him to finally address these allegations on his own. He had been hiding behind female Democratic politicians who would go on cable news shows and defend him and say that they believed him. We found out through BuzzFeed News that his camp had handed out talking points to his surrogates and supporters, and those exact talking points were regurgitated on cable news by these Democratic female politicians. That is not enough to satisfy voters who are actually principled on issues like sexual assault, and he needs to address this in a better way, not only to clear his name, but to make sure that the public knows the truth about what happens. We might not ever get to that truth, but the fact that he's being he's not being as transparent as he can be, makes people even more suspicious of what happened in the 1990s.
Yeah, I mean, maximum transparency in situations like this is probably a good rule of thumb, right? I want to go to a Politico article from yesterday, which was interesting about this idea of the burden falling on women to defend Joe Biden. We can get up a couple of quotes from that. Joe Biden has already confirmed that his vice presidential candidate will be a woman. And of the women who are most likely to be Biden's vice presidential nominee, most have been very vocal in opposing Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. And this is relevant because then the Democratic slogan was "Believe Women." This was a right-wing nominee by Donald Trump to the Supreme Court who had very credible allegations of sexual assault against him. Let's go to a couple of quotes. So this is the first one. "Believe the woman didn't mean believe all women all the time. But this is an era of slogans and we're paying the price for that," said an advisor to one of the women under consideration for vice presidential candidate, noting Reid's story changed over time. Let's go to the next one. "The hashtag #MeToo movement was an overcorrection to decades of ignoring women and not believing them. And what we're seeing now is a result of that overcorrection," the advisor said. "It's not ideal. It's not what we want to be talking about." And let's just go to the first one again briefly, because it's just this line: "Believe the woman didn't mean believe all women all the time." I mean, this is all very uncomfortable, isn't it, Anna?
Well, it's enlightening. It's certainly enlightening, because what's become increasingly clear to me, and it's not only due to what we're experiencing with this Biden story, it's other political stories that we've covered throughout the years. Issues of sexual assault have been used in the past as nothing more than a political tool by the Republican Party in order to destroy certain politicians they disagree with, their political opponents. I didn't want to believe that the Democratic Party would stoop as low as they have in defending Joe Biden. And I've realized that while they've certainly used instances of alleged sexual assault for their political advantage, in this case, they are taking a very right-wing strategy, tactic, in smearing Tara Reid in an effort to discredit her and defend Joe Biden. That type of Trumpian behavior is not appealing to progressives in this country. It's not appealing to female voters in this country. And if you can recall, in 2016, white female voters overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. And so if Biden wants to win, if the Democratic Party is genuine and sincere in saying that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. We absolutely must get Donald Trump out of office. They need to take these allegations seriously, and they need to avoid using Trump-like tactics in smearing Tara Reade. And I do want to make a comment about the second quote that you read, because this allegation that Tara Reade has changed her story is probably the most frustrating part of the defense that I've seen of Joe Biden, because she hasn't changed her story. She's only added more detail to her story. When she first came out with allegations against Joe Biden, it was in regard to times that he would touch her, allegedly touch her in the office or at work in ways that made her uncomfortable. And she referred to it as sexual assault. As soon as she went public with that, she was attacked, I mean, viciously on social media. The press went through her Medium account and found that she had written some positive blog posts about Russia, and they started accusing her of being a Russian agent. At that point, she was shaken by it, based on what she says, and she decided to stop talking about the allegations, and she didn't share the more problematic issues of sexual assault. Later, she decided, no, I need to come out. I need to be as transparent as possible about what she allegedly experienced. And that was when she elaborated and gave us more details. And so she's never changed her story. If you ever ask a follow-up question to the people using this talking point, they'll have nothing to give you other than, well, at first she came out and said it was sexual harassment, and then she said sexual assault. No, the harassment claims still stand. But again, she elaborated and gave more detail into the sexual assault allegation later.
I want to talk about how the media is covering this and how the Democratic establishment is covering this. And I'll bring in Aaron for this discussion. First of all, I want to show a video. This is Chris Hayes, who I think, I mean, you might correct me, but he seems to me to be the most progressive mainstream pundit in the United States. He hosts a primetime show on MSNBC. And he was, I think, the first real mainstream pundit to come out and address these claims.
There have been moments, I think for many of us, all of us, when we have heard about accusations against someone that we find ourselves desperately wanting not to believe, whether that is because we have some personal admiration for the individual or their work, or political admiration, someone on our quote unquote side. But part of the difficult lesson of the Me Too era is not that every accusation is true and everything should be believed on its face, but that you do have to fight yourself when you feel that impulse. You have to do that in order to take seriously what is being alleged and what the evidence is and to evaluate it. And that is the case with the accusation by a woman named Tara Reade against Joe Biden.
So, I mean, that's a very reasonable, nuanced thing to say. It's to say when you hear an allegation against someone who you might be more politically aligned with, or at least more politically aligned with than the person they're standing against, you might have an inclination to want to ignore it. But we shouldn't. We should look at the facts objectively. But him coming out and saying that on MSNBC, on mainstream liberal television, there was a complete freak out, right? There was a hashtag trending, fire Chris Hayes. I was wondering, can you just comment on what is the atmosphere in the United States when people want to treat these claims seriously? How much pressure is there to basically smother this story?
Oh, there's a tremendous amount of pressure to smother this story. And even though Chris Hayes is certainly the most progressive cable news host in America, the truth is he works for MSNBC, which has really propped up establishment Democratic candidates like Joe Biden. In fact, my boss and colleague, Cenk Uygur, was censored from MSNBC because he was critical of the Obama administration. They decided, hey, you know what? We're going to take you off of primetime and pay you more to host a weekend show that no one's going to watch, because he refused to stop criticizing Obama. So there is a tremendous amount of pressure for the hosts at that cable news channel to toe a certain line. And so I am a little worried about what this means for Chris Hayes, because there was just this outpouring of anger and resentment because he had the audacity to do his job appropriately and cover this story fairly. I mean, he didn't go out there and say Joe Biden is 100% guilty. He came out and shared what the details of this story are. And I think the American public deserves to know that. And then for, the liberals who might accept that, they'll then move on to, well, you have to address the fact that Donald Trump has more sexual assault allegations against him. But I have to be honest with you, as a woman especially, I think that it's disgusting to be forced into a place where you have to do like an analysis of which sexual assault or which sexual predator is the worst. Sexual assault is sexual assault. I'm not going to have a conversation about whether or not someone's better if they only have one allegation of sexual assault versus Donald Trump, who at this point probably has dozens.
Aaron, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to ask, really, I mean, you talked about MSNBC, so a few questions in regards to the reception of these allegations from elsewhere. Firstly, how's it being treated by an obviously more hostile right-wing broadcast media towards Joe Biden? They obviously have a big vested interest in going very hard on this in a way that MSNBC doesn't. And how is the sort of legacy print media, Washington Post, New York Times responding to it? Is there any nuance here? Are there any outlets which aren't, covering themselves in, whatever the opposite of glory is?
Well, I think it's first important to note that a number of legacy media outlets, including the New York Times and Washington Post, stayed away from this story and refused to cover it at all. It received absolutely no attention from these outlets until there were pretty excellent pieces published by Ryan Grimm over at The Intercept. That was when they started taking it a little more seriously. Now, this is an issue just based on journalistic ethics alone. But aside from that, these allegations came out while the Democratic primary was in full force. We didn't have to end up with a candidate who has a serious and credible sexual assault allegation against them. But here we are, because the story was buried for weeks until there was enough pressure that the New York Times and the Washington Post finally decided to cover it. Now, in terms of the type of coverage, it is nuanced. I would argue that for the most part, when the New York Times finally did decide to publish their piece on this, it was lengthy, it was detailed, and I think if I had to say I give it a pass, I would give it a pass. My only issue with them is they immediately felt the need in like the third or fourth paragraph to do a comparative analysis between Donald Trump and Joe Biden when it comes to sexual assault claims. I didn't think that that was necessary. You want to mention that toward the bottom of your piece, that's fine. But it was almost as if the writers were trying to tell the readers, like, this looks bad and it looks like there is some corroborating evidence, but just remember, Donald Trump is far worse. I didn't like that kind of messaging. But if it weren't for The Intercept, if it weren't for the investigative journalists who really went out of their way to find, evidence that corroborates some portions of Tara Reade's story, I don't think this story would ever be covered by the mainstream press.
And do you think the likes of? Sorry, I was wondering. Did you think the likes of Fox News would have gone in a bit harder, sort of right wing press? Because obviously Donald Trump would have been very eager to amplify these kinds of stories in the run up to December. Or how does that sort of interface with this?
Well, you got to remember that Donald Trump is in cahoots with Fox News. They're constantly communicating with one another. Fox News at this point is state-run television. And so I had read a piece about how Trump was elated about these allegations, but decided to hold fire because he understood that we were still dealing with the primaries and there was still an opportunity for either Bernie to win, which, he has said himself in leaked audio that he would have lost the 2016 election had he been the nominee. So he did not want Bernie to be the nominee. And Biden, even without the sexual assault allegation, he has difficulty in debates. He has difficulty in interviews. I think that Trump was hoping that Biden would be the eventual nominee. Now he is. He didn't want to touch the sexual assault allegation until it was confirmed and kind of, set in stone that Biden would be the nominee. Now that it seems like we're headed in that direction, I do think that Trump will, start attacking him viciously, because that's what he does. Even though Trump's dealing with his own sexual assault allegations, remember, during one of the debates with Hillary Clinton, he brought all of these women who had these sexual assault allegations against Bill Clinton to the debate. They were sitting front row watching. And so that's the kind of person Donald Trump is. He plays offense. He plays hard. He's a toxic and vicious person. And I'm concerned that eventually he will use this sexual assault allegation against Joe Biden. And I mean, it's certainly something that he could use. Why wouldn't he?
I mean, I want to talk about the presidential election more generally. I mean, you've got a pretty I mean, it's almost unbelievable, the choice that the American people have been presented with. You know, you've got on the one side Donald Trump, who's telling people to drink disinfectant to try and cure coronavirus. On the other hand, you've got Joe Biden, who's talking about economic intercourse live on television. Like, how do you see the next few months panning out? Is it plausible that Biden is replaced? Like, do you think you are genuinely going to have to face the choice in November of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump?
I'm honestly split on it. The Democratic Party never ceases to amaze me with the terrible decisions they make over and over again. So if Biden is badly hurt by these sexual assault allegations and is also hurt by the fact that he's in obvious mental decline, I mean, it's happening right in front of us. We can all see it. We could all hear it. It's not far-fetched for them to refuse to replace him. It really isn't. At this point, and I'm not delusional, we have an incredibly corrupt system in the United States. Money above voters, money above ethics, money above morality. And so the entire democratic structure is based on this donor model, and these wealthy donors make the decisions at the end of the day. And so I don't think that they're necessarily going to replace him. If they do, I'm not delusional enough to think that they would actually replace him with the most democratic option, which would be Bernie Sanders. I think that they're likely to replace him with another corporate Democrat. And quite honestly, at this point, because I do understand the urgency of removing Donald Trump, I would settle for that. I just don't think that Biden is electable. And I think that this sexual assault allegation is certainly credible. And I would feel uncomfortable casting my vote for him.
So you'd settle for a kind of Governor Cuomo type figure if there was a possibility of sort of replacing Joe Biden with someone like him?
I think that would be a better option than Joe Biden, but I don't want anyone in the audience to mistake that as any type of endorsement or love toward Governor Cuomo. I mean, Governor Cuomo is the standard corporate Democrat who would make disastrous decisions. He's just not an unhinged, unstable individual like Donald Trump, who is really a threat to our democracy.
I want to ask,
or whatever's left of it.
I want to ask a question about what you do and about the Young Turks. Incredibly influential show in the United States, but it has been very aligned with Bernie Sanders in a similar way that we were to Jeremy Corbyn. Now that candidacy is over, sort of where do you see your future strategic direction, and how are you going to relate to this presidential candidate when, to be honest, no one on show offers that much to be excited by? One is just more repulsive than the other. How is your coverage going to be? What's it going to look like from now until November, the Young Turks?
Well, I think that our coverage is going to remain, unfortunately, largely the same, where there's plenty of critique to go around, whether the politicians we're talking about are Democrats or Republicans. We of course have an advocacy component to what we do, and we advocate for progressive policies. We're going to continue the fight for single payer healthcare. We're going to continue holding Nancy Pelosi's feet to the fire, regardless of how, toxic she's going to be, regardless of how much she's going to retaliate. And she certainly does retaliate. We've seen it with her treatment toward Representative Ocasio-Cortez and other freshman progressive Democrats. But, our job is to promote progressive proposals. That's what we believe in. And if we are seeing Democrats go in a further right-wing direction, I mean, this trend has been happening for decades now, we're going to continue, influencing the public through our information, through the facts, and through the types of stories that, unfortunately, legacy media and mainstream media outlets here in the United States refuse to cover. I mean, it's kind of incredible how much people living in other countries know about our system of government, know about our political issues, know about our flaws, and maybe even things that work. But in America, we're discouraged from learning about other systems. We're discouraged from learning about the Nordic model or what's happening in some of these Scandinavian countries. And that's the reason why I think older Americans hear a word like socialism and they panic. But there is a future for progressivism in the United States. I mean, if you poll young voters, millennial voters, and the so-called Zoomers, they're overwhelmingly left. And we need to support them. We need to find avenues in which they can get elected into office. And we need to take the power, because right now we have this corrupt model. We have incredibly old democratic leadership. And I don't just mean old as in their age. I mean, they've been in power forever. And we need to find a way to change that. So we're going to focus on more strategic conversations on how to get more progressives into Congress, and also how to mobilize and organize workers to get what we desperately need in this country, which is more unionized work, more unionized jobs, better pay, and better accountability when it comes to the executives in these companies.
Yeah, I feel like we spoke actually on a Jacobin call a couple of weeks ago, and we had something akin to this conversation where I feel that the experience of the last 6 months in Britain and the United States is quite similar, in so much as the left believed they could lead a broader coalition with the centre. We call it liberals. You wouldn't call it liberals in the US, but you know who I mean, the kind of MSNBC crowd. Now, that's always been the coalition behind Obama or behind Hillary Clinton in 2016, but obviously it was being led from the centre. And they're always accustomed to leading that coalition. Same with Labour in this country. They take left votes for granted, the Labour movement for granted, blue collar workers for granted. Now, what Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn did was kind of capsize that, whereby you had the same coalition, but for the first time in a very long time, they said, well, actually now these coalitions are going to be led from the left, by left-wing politicians. To what extent do you think the experience of the last 6 years, 6 months, the United States kind of means that's not possible? Has the kind of extent of the kickback against Bernie Sanders and the kind of almost unthoughtful, unstrategic support for Joe Biden, do you think it's plausible to have a coalition between the centre and the left where the left is allowed to lead? Or do you just think we have to rethink our entire theory of change and how we're going to bring about progressive reforms in the United States?
I think that it's a fool's errand to think that you can work with the so-called moderates of the Democratic Party, because the moderates of the Democratic Party are not actually influenced by policy, right? So when they come at policy from a more right-wing perspective, it's not because they genuinely believe it. It's because they're receiving campaign donations from the same corporate influences that fund Republican politicians, right? So I think that that's like one of the biggest issues here. And now I apologize for being as amused by the story as I am, but I'm reading about how Joe Biden's donors are telling him that he cannot choose Elizabeth Warren as his running mate. They refuse to support him if he does. And she was under the impression that, hey, maybe if I work with these moderates, with these corporate Democrats, with the very person who encouraged me to become a politician because I was so disgusted by his bankruptcy bill, if I just work with those people, maybe we'll get some progressive proposals out there. That it's not going to work that way. The moderates are never going to allow the progressives to be in charge. They despise the moderates. You see it in their rhetoric. You see it in the discourse, and that's not going to change. What I think will change, though, is certain influencing factors, the media, for instance. More and more young people are getting all of their news coverage and content through independent sources. And there really wasn't progressive media prior to Bernie running in 2016. He kind of started getting some name recognition after we were interested in him. We started covering him, and then we started noticing all of these other progressive independent media sources popping up all over the place. I absolutely love that, because eventually the cable news model will be obsolete. Young people don't watch cable news. Everyone who watches cable news is in their 60s and 70s, and that's fantastic. So I think that, yes, there are things that we can learn from from the last 6 months. But one thing that I don't want is for progressives to become discouraged. Luckily, I haven't seen it. I don't think that most people are discouraged. I don't think they want to give up. But what we do need to do is find strategic avenues, whether through getting elected into Congress or really amplifying progressive voices in independent media to bolster progressive candidates. And one other thing, actually, I think that we need to make a better case for what type of common ground we have with average voters, regardless of their political identity. I think that sometimes the left can get a little too caught up in, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, the identity politics in America, right? So the thing that really does improve everyone's life, regardless of your race, your sexual identity, your gender identity, is a better economic system, a just economic system where we also decommodify parts of our society that should be considered a human right, like healthcare. And so, yes, we should fight for transgender rights. Yes, we should fight to do something about the fact that we imprison more Black men in this country than any other group of or any other demographic. But when we start rejecting the economic policies that really do bring us all together, I think that it hurts all of us, regardless of which disenfranchised group we identify with.
Ana, it's so brilliant to have you on Novara Media for the first time. We'll definitely be incredibly keen to get you back on over the coming weeks and months to talk about the presidential election as it develops and politics in America more generally. We are obviously massive fans of the Young Turks, and I don't even need to advertise it to our audience because I know from the comments under our videos, they all are as well. But we're going to let you go now, unless, Aaron, you want to...
No, that's everything. I think you're right. Let's
Perfect.
get Ana back on in the next couple of months. There's a lot going on in the US over the course of 2020. So
Absolutely.
I'd love to do it.
Ana
Thank you so
Kasparian.
much.
Yes, definitely. Good night.
night.
Our next guest, we're going to go from one amazing guest to another. Actually, in a moment, we're going to speak to Yara Hawari, who's going to be speaking to us live from the West Bank. But first of all, there are 1,700 people watching this show. We want to get it to 2,000 tonight. And make sure you subscribe to this channel because we want to get our subscription numbers up. Our next story. So coronavirus is obviously a global pandemic, but it affects different countries in different ways. That's partly about demographics, about average incomes, and about average ages. But political factors also matter. And that's especially the case for people living under occupation. That, of course, is a situation for millions of Palestinians right now. So to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on Palestine, I'm delighted to be joined by Yara Hawari, an academic and writer based in the West Bank. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start by, I suppose, just you giving us a bit of background of how coronavirus is affecting Palestine and what it is like to be facing a global pandemic under occupation.
Yeah, well, as you said in your introduction, it affects vulnerable communities worldwide, and Palestinians living under occupation are one of those communities. You know, what makes the situation different in Palestine from other places is it is really a reality of apartheid, and in the case of the West Bank and Gaza, a situation of additional Israeli military occupation. And what this does is it weakens the ability of the Palestinian authorities and the Palestinian people to respond effectively to this deadly virus. Now, in the case of the West Bank and Gaza, which has been under military occupation for over 53 years, the medical capabilities have been seriously depleted, and the healthcare system is entirely dependent on foreign aid money. So what this means is that there's shortages in equipment, in medication, in staff, because of the restrictions on imports and military raids from the Israeli military regime. And in Gaza in particular, which, may I remind you, was actually deemed unlivable by 2020 by a UN report as a result of the Israeli blockade, which has been ongoing for over 13 years, and the multiple wars. The healthcare system has been so devastated, it already struggles to deal with the medical cases that were present before the pandemic. And just to give a really stark figure indeed, Gaza currently only has 78 ICU beds and 63 ventilators for a population of 2 million people. And on top of that, on top of the seriously low capabilities to deal with this pandemic, the daily manifestations of violence from the Israeli regime persist, such as the demolition of Palestinian homes, military raids on Palestinian villages towns and cities. But more insidious has been the direct Israeli attacks on Palestinian attempts to confront the virus, such as the destruction of a COVID-19 clinic in the Jordan Valley, the arrest of Palestinian volunteers who were attempting to distribute supplies to impoverished families in East Jerusalem, the shutting down of yet another COVID-19 clinic in Sidwan, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, because they were using tests, coronavirus tests that were provided by the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis shut it down. So overall, Palestinians live very insecure and uncertain lives because of the Israeli apartheid regime. And the pandemic really adds another layer to that insecurity and uncertainty. So whilst, you know, the so-called lockdown for people all around the world is easing up, many Palestinians actually live under permanent lockdown, with their movement inside and outside of Palestine entirely controlled by the Israeli regime.
I wanted to talk specifically about that because many people around the world, we're in lockdown, and it's the first time we haven't been able to leave our houses for state-sanctioned reasons. I've never lived under a curfew before, so I wanted to know, to what extent is the lockdown you're currently under different to what Palestinian people are usually used to dealing with? Obviously, for many of the world, our movement is limited, but that's not a new thing for people who are living under Israeli occupation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between the lockdown and the curfew now is that it's being enforced in an attempt to save lives rather than disrupt lives, which is, of course, the aim of the lockdowns and curfews imposed by the Israeli military regime. The usual sort of restriction of movements for Palestinians really depends on where they are. So in the West Bank, for example, the land has been divided up into Bantustans, i.e. small pockets of Palestinian populations where there's no sovereignty at all, where actually even the Palestinian Authority president has to ask permission from the Israelis to leave Ramallah, the city in which he lives. And these Bantustans are connected by roads which are also controlled by the Israelis, and they're crisscrossed by Israeli settler-only roads. Checkpoints litter the West Bank and can be set up randomly. So your ability to get from point A to point B in the West Bank is never guaranteed. And even more so, Palestinians with West Bank IDs can only leave the West Bank with the permission of the Israeli regime, because Israel controls all of the borders. And many Palestinians live under a travel ban. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the situation is 100 times worse. It's basically an open-air prison where very few Palestinians actually can come in or go out at all.
In an odd way, I mean, obviously, these restrictions on movements are put in place for incredibly oppressive and discriminatory reasons. But given that movement of people from country to country is one of the reasons why COVID-19 spreads and why hotspots develop, I mean, how widespread is coronavirus in Palestine? Is there an extent to which it being cut off from other regions has been helpful in limiting the outbreak?
Yeah, I think that's actually an incredibly problematic narrative, and it's very misleading. And it was used in particular with reference to Gaza. It was this narrative that Gaza was protected because it was under siege, that everything going in and coming out was determined by the Israeli regime. So actually the blockade was a saving grace. Now, what is left out of that discourse is the fact that the blockade has actually devastated the healthcare system, and that thousands of people die every year in Gaza as a direct result of the siege, either because they can't get the medical care, the basic medical care that they need, or because they're being bombed and shot and killed by the Israeli army, or because of the intense poverty and food insecurity that they face. So, I mean, what this narrative is essentially saying is that imprisoned people are safer from others from the pandemic. But we know that COVID-19 doesn't stop at borders. It's found its way into prisons, actual prisons. It's found its way to remote villages. So I think we have to be very careful with that narrative. And the fact that there hasn't been a mass outbreak in Palestine, although I have to say that the statistics that we do have, the official statistics, I think are not entirely accurate because of the lack of mass testing here, because we do not have access to tests I think the reason that there hasn't been a mass outbreak is because the Palestinian authorities took quite quick measures to shut everything down. And also there's been a general adherence to the lockdown by the population because of this acute fear of the lack of capabilities of the health service. It doesn't mean that there still won't be one. We are still living under that fear that it still might happen. But I think it's important to note that in the months and maybe even the years to come, we're going to see serious repercussions from the pandemic, perhaps not necessarily people dying as a result of the illness itself, but there's going to be a massive economic fallout, the increased surveillance. All of these things are going to have a really detrimental effect on Palestinians and other vulnerable communities around the world.
And final question from me. After 3 general elections in 12 months, Israel now has a new coalition government. It's led by Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, who were, in opposing parties. They were fighting to become prime minister. Now they're going to sort of share the role. Does this change anything for Palestinians, or is it ultimately irrelevant which of these two figures became prime minister?
Yeah, I mean, I think so Netanyahu and Gantz have agreed to this unity government in response to the pandemic, and it served as quite a shock to a lot of Gantz's supporters because his electoral campaign was basically based on anti-Netanyahu rhetoric, and he positioned himself as an alternative to Netanyahu's corrupt regime, and there was a lot of liberals supporting Gantz and a lot of third parties and international actors who saw him as a potential partner for peace, despite the fact that he used images of bombing Gaza in 2014 in his electoral campaign, despite the fact that he boasted that he would be the one to annex the West Bank. And I think it's important to note that the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were not even part of the electoral period's discussion. It demonstrates really where the Israeli electorate is at. Many are quite happy with the containment of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Now, part of the agreement between Netanyahu and Gantz was that they will pass legislation to annex large parts of the West Bank. Now, the annexation of Palestinian land that was occupied in 1967 is illegal under international law. But the reality on the ground is that the West Bank has already been annexed, has already been de facto annexed. The Israeli regime is now merely looking to de jure annex the certain areas of the West Bank. In other words, bringing it under Israeli domestic law. And the fact that Israeli leaders across the political spectrum are pursuing annexation is not surprising at all. Expansionism into Palestinian land has basically been at the essence of the Israeli regime ever since its foundation in 1948. And it was a so-called left-wing government after 1967, a Labour Israeli government that spearheaded the settlement enterprise into the West Bank and Gaza. So to answer your question in one sentence, this new government isn't new at all. It means absolutely nothing new for the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, it means a continuation of apartheid, of oppression, and of settler colonial expansionism.
Yara Hawari, thank you so much for joining us, and solidarity in under occupation. We'll keep in touch and hopefully speak to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Aaron, are you still there?
I'm here. Your picture, Yara's picture, was better than yours.
Oh, is my picture okay now?
It's better. It's weird. The longer you stay in shot, I think we'll be okay with a two-hander because you look great now, Michael.
Okay, our final story is fixing the testing numbers. So at the start of April, Matt Hancock made a pledge or set a target that the government would be doing 100,000 coronavirus tests per day. It seemed ambitious at the time, but today at the Daily Briefing, he claimed victory.
I can announce that we have met our goal. The number of tests yesterday, on the last day of April, was 122,347. This unprecedented expansion in British testing capability is an incredible achievement, but it is not my achievement. It is a national achievement.
So it is a huge achievement. Before we say anything else, I'm not going to knock a massive expansion in testing. But let's see what number 10 was originally saying in regards to expanded testing in a tweet. I think this was from the 5th of April. We'll test 100,000 people a day by the end of this month. Here's how. Then outlines how. Rapidly increasing swab testing, commercial swab testing, antibody testing, surveillance testing, national diagnostics testing. Then we can go to graphic 5, please, Fox. This is a bit of a tell. 122,000 tests. People tested, 73,000. Now, why is there that big discrepancy there? It's because many people have had tests sent through the post, but they've not actually been tested. Now, you might think this is just an exercise in pedantry, and partly it is. But at the same time, there has not been 100,000 people tested, as was promised at the beginning of April. Important to say, actually, I believe it was in early March, the original pledge was for 250,000 daily tests. That was downgraded to 100,000. Now we're at 73,000, which is apparently 100,000. It obviously isn't. But Michael, I'm going to hand back to you. I just want to say, clearly, it's a massive ramping up in testing. And the government's done well. It's good. It shows what you can do with central planning and state intervention. But they still haven't met the targets that they set.
Yes, I mean, that's the real issue here, isn't it? I mean, you have to admit, yeah, they've managed to increase testing by quite a large extent. But why do they have to also lie? You know, why do they have to fudge the statistics instead of just being honest? And it does make you think that they are putting PR above public health. I obviously had to duck out of the studio for a moment there because I was going pixelated. So I'm not quite sure what we've covered. Have we gone through the HSJ article?
No, go for that. We've just gone through.
We haven't done that.
We went through today's wonderful news from the press conference, then went to the tweet from early April, and then actually how they haven't met 100,000. Go to HSJ.
Okay, yes. So we're now going to a different story. So one issue in which they didn't meet their target is they said they're going to test 100,000 people. In fact, they've only tested 73,000 people. There was actually a more serious discrepancy between a normal understanding of 100,000 tests and what the government was actually able to deliver. This was broken in the HSJ newspaper today. We're going to go to a couple of quotes from that. So it says the government has changed the way it is counting the number of COVID-19 tests carried out in a bid to hit its target of 100,000 tests per day by the end of April, HSJ can reveal. Previously, a test would be counted once the sample had been processed in laboratories, but this definition has been changed in the last few days, a senior source told HSJ. The Department of Health and Social Care is now including tests that have been posted or delivered to people's homes in its figures. This means tests which are sent to people are counted before the recipient has provided and returned their sample to a laboratory. HSJ understands that up to 50,000 of the tests that will be reported as having taken place on the 30th of April will actually represent the mailing or the agreeing to mail a home testing kit. So, I mean, this is, if someone tells you they've done 100,000 tests today, under any normal understanding of what it means to do a test, you would not accept you've posted a test to someone who's yet to do it. You know, the key issue when it comes to testing people for coronavirus is not only testing them, but also getting back the results quite quickly. Because the reason you want to know if you have coronavirus is because you want to take appropriate measures to not pass it on to anyone. And when we end up having a system, hopefully, of contact tracing, timing is incredibly important. So what we need to be counting is how many people got their results today and how many people got their results within 24 hours, because you need it that quickly if you're going to do contact tracing. Not how many tests have you sent out in the post. We can look at the precise breakdown of how the tests were made up. There, 122,000 figure, which was initially impressive, but which became a lot less impressive. Let's get up graphic 7. This is from Dan Bloom, Mirror reporter. So of the 122,347 tests, that's 73,000 individual people tested. But although that figure actually gets less impressive as well, because only 39,000 of those were tests which were done in NHS, Public Health England, and devolved administration labs. So, you know, in the proper government labs. 3,000 were in the surveillance program. So what that means is the antibody testing that was being done to find out how widespread COVID-19 has been in the community. So to work out what proportion of the population have had COVID-19. Obviously, very important, but it's kind of separate project, separate issue. 40,000 are in these drive-through programs. They're a good development, can't complain about those. But 40,000 were merely posted out, so the results haven't yet come in. And one thing that struck me actually about this is those 40,000 that have been posted out, presumably they didn't send 2 tests to the same people. So of that 73,000 individual people tested, I presume 40,000 of those include people who've had it posted. So presumably that means only 33,000 people were actually tested and got their results back by the time this announcement was made. The reason why you have more tests than people being tested is because sometimes people need to get tested twice to confirm a positive, or if a negative seems unrealistic. So basically you've got a government which is massively fudging numbers, and in a way unnecessarily, because the raw numbers, the numbers without being completely misleading, weren't terrible considering the starting point the government found themselves in, which on many shows we talked about was a disgraceful starting point to find oneself in, but progress is progress. I want to bring up a tweet from the BBC to show that whilst common sense would suggest that what the government is saying is misleading, our public broadcasters are very much happy to swallow it. So this is a BBC tweet. BBC breaking news. So obviously this is the kind of thing that pops up on your notifications on your phone. So this is actually one of the most important things that the BBC can put out. People who don't read much news, they do still get their notification on their phone. The UK carried out 122,000 coronavirus tests on the last day of April, passing the government's target. Now, what definition of carried out includes sent in the post? Like what No definition of carried out a test includes sending a test in the post. That's just basic understanding of the English language. And I mean, it's kind of cynical that you have a government who is, willing to twist the meaning of words to try and meet an arbitrary target which they set themselves. It's disappointing, but they're a government and they do public relations, and sometimes they do spin. For the BBC, for the public broadcaster to accept that redefinition of words and to report as news that 122,000 tests were carried out that day, when of that number 40,000 were only posted, I think shows an almost. I find it quite scary actually that the BBC would just repeat what is clearly a lie, unless you are willing to completely adopt this alternate world where carried out includes posted.
Yeah,
Aaron.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, that was an outright untruth. And like I said, it's the sort of thing that goes as a push notification to millions of people. And it's why I almost feel sorry for this. There's been so much good journalism on this in the BBC in recent days and weeks. You saw it with Lewis Goodall. I thought Newsnight, now that Corbyn's gone, Newsnight's actually a relatively good current affairs show again, because they actually cover stories of major public interest rather than harass a single MP in Islington North. But of course, at the Panorama documentary as well. Brilliant pieces of journalism covering this. But that's all undermined by this, because fundamentally, those will only be seen by hundreds of thousands of people, whereas a push notification like that, something which goes onto the main BBC website, something which leads the 6 o'clock news, that becomes common sense, because, of course, the BBC has 80% of news broadcast market share in this country, goes on BBC Radio 4, etc. It's fundamentally irresponsible. And it's when you see stuff like that, you think, the BBC really is really bad. It has major problems. It's probably not worth defending, because that's fundamentally untrue. Like I said, it's under no definition of tests being carried out do tests being mailed out qualify. And also the presumption that every single test is going to be sent. Clearly, that's not true, right? There'll be an element of wastage. Of the 50,000 tests that are mailed out, 5% won't get to the target. I don't know. How are we going to work this out? Or how many will go to people that no longer live at that address, or 2 people at the same address, or the 2 tests of the same person? How many of them will work? How many will be completed? How many be returned? I mean, this is nuts. Maybe only 80%, maybe 90%. I don't know. I mean, 70%. And I say that because this is a government which is already dealing with stockpiles of aprons, which didn't exist. right? According to its own guidance, there should have been stockpiles of aprons ahead of this pandemic. They weren't there. There are 21 million masks unaccounted for. Why should I believe that these 50,000 tests, which were mailed out to people, has been done so effectively that everybody's got them and everybody's going to return them, when it's the exact same government which can't account for 21 million masks? You know, it stretches the powers of human credulity to such an extent that the BBC indulging this exercise in extravagant bullshit is embarrassing itself.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, you can put as a push notification the government claimed to have met 122,000 tests over the last 24 hours, because the government have claimed it. That's a fact. But the government have carried out 122,000. Not true. That is the government, sorry, the BBC sending a push notification to everyone, which is fake. It's fake news, and it's completely unnecessary. We probably do have time for a couple of questions. So if you've got a question today, put it on the hashtag #TiskiSour or in the comments under the video. But yeah, I suppose do you think the government are they obviously were horrendous at the start of this crisis, and they were kind of horrendous because they weren't taking it seriously, right? They just thought, you know, we're British, we can just take this on the chin. I mean, they literally used those words. But the fact that, you know, they have managed to get up to 80-odd thousand tests in a month. That's a reasonably impressive feat of state, even if they're now dressing it up with completely, you know, fudge statistics, which actually undermines what they've managed to do. But you know, the government this month is better than the government at the end of the month is better than the government at the beginning of the month, isn't it?
Well, yes and no, because I think they've fallen short on so many things. If it was just this, but PPE wasn't an issue.
We need them to set an arbitrary target, because it's
the
only reason they've this is an important point, actually, because the only reason they've done this many tests is because people are saying, oh, it's good that Matt Hancock set an ambitious test. The target wasn't initially supposed to be ambitious. So the target of 100,000 tests was supposed to be made up by 30,000 antigen tests, so 30,000 swab tests, and 70,000 antibody tests, the blood tests. And they were supposed to be, the blood tests are very cheap. You do just post them out and everyone can test themselves. And then it turned out that the antibody tests didn't work. So that's why they suddenly had this incredibly ambitious target, which was to do 100,000 antigen tests, which, you know, swab tests in 24 hours. So in fact, whilst it has potentially had a useful outcome, it's a completely accidental target that they found themselves with. So we need them to get some more accidental targets, perhaps.
Also important to say, of the 77,000 that have been actually done, right? 77,000, 3,000 of those were the antigen tests, which probably don't work.
The antibody tests.
Sorry, antibody tests, quite right. They probably don't work. Or there was such a large number of the tests that the UK procured which didn't work. They basically throw into doubt just how useful they are. So again, another aspect of these numbers not really adding up.
Sorry, need to cough there. I'm in my own house and it's not persistent, which means that I'm still fine, I think. I'm just going to have a look on the hashtag #TiskiSour. Oh, interesting. You'll have a good answer on this. This is going to be our only question, because Fox is telling us we're at 60 minutes. Why is Lord Dubs unqualified for the Labour Party investigation into anti-Semitism? Perhaps you could sort of introduce what this question is alluding to. What's the story here?
Yeah. We'll talk about this early next week. But basically today there was a meeting of the NEC. They determined who would be on the panel to oversee this quote-unquote independent investigation into the leaked Labour report, the contents of which were covered by Novara Media exclusively. It won't just be looking at the contents of that report, but also how it came to be leaked, because, of course, there's issues as to privacy, data breaches, etc. Now, in response to the revelations exposed by, among others, ourselves, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner a couple of weeks back said that there'll be this independent investigation. Today, we found out who the panel was going to be. It is 4 people. Some of them don't look particularly well disposed to the job, highly factional. Now, the reason why Lord Dubs, who's Jewish, wasn't chosen was because apparently he's a Keir Starmer supporter. And yet, I believe it was Baroness Wilcox. If you go through her tweets, she's kind of like a Keir Starmer superfan, tweeting stuff about Ian McNichol, saying this is an end on the Corbyn chapter. She's clearly not impartial. She's clearly not objective. She's inappropriate. One of them is a general secretary from basically the Kinnock years, when they, got rid of, they smashed the left. There was a clear anti-black bias in the organization where black parliamentary candidates were sidelined for other candidates who were more disposed and more loyal to the Kinnock leadership. And so many people are saying, this isn't good enough. This panel isn't good enough. I think the most worrying thing of all, and I'll finish with this, is the fact that the short list of candidates for the panel was basically taken to the NEC. Nobody at NEC had seen this list beforehand. So, of course, you can't conduct any due diligence on whether or not these are an appropriate selection of people. John Lansman comes out of the meeting. He then says, well, this is just a stitch up. It's a fix. And I think actually, quite frankly, it is a fix. It is a stitch up. And that's particularly worrying because this is a report into a culture of corruption, of internal sabotage, and of unelected senior staff and management, not only disobeying and disregarding the thoughts and the actions of the Labour leadership, but having a fundamental antipathy to Labour Party members and even MPs that they personally didn't like. Now, the idea that you respond to that with an investigation overseen by a panel which has had no real oversight from the NEC is outrageous. And fundamentally, Lord Dubs was pitched because the gentleman's Jewish. One of the key findings of that leaked report was the fact that it appears that former members of the Labour sort of staff, senior management, and slightly lower down the food chain too, actually sat on very serious complaints regarding anti-Semitism because they thought it might help to undermine and hinder the Corbyn leadership. Now, those allegations needs to be addressed, but clearly you would want more BAME people. The gentleman leading up is black, but other than that, there's no Jewish people. There's no Muslim people. I think these are two minorities which really have been really neglected in terms of how they're treated by the Labour Party apparatus, according to this report. And yet, Lord Dubs isn't there. There's no Muslim voice there either. That's why I think people should be very, very suspect of the people overseeing this report. We'll talk about it more on Monday. But yes, early conclusion is it's very much a fix. The fix is in. And people who thought, including myself, that Keir Starmer might oversee something which was impartial and really deferred to due process, I think we're in for a bit of a shock.
This is obviously a story we'll be covering a lot on Novara Media, both in our articles, many of which Aaron is penning, and also on Tysky Sour. That's us for this evening. We'll be back on Monday. Have a restful weekend. And if you do want to support our work, please go to novaramedia.com/support. It is our subscribers that make this show possible. Please throw us 1 hour's wage a month or give us a lockdown bonus. I've been Michael Walker. We've been Tysky Sour. Good night.